Hello, I'm Ruth and welcome to my second Jane Austen video. This time I'm going to be talking about her fourth novel, Emma, first published in 1815. I'll be comparing and reviewing four adaptations of Emma, the two 1996 versions, the 2009 version and the 2020 version. I'm not really discussing the modern retelling Clueless, though it fully deserves its iconic chick flick status. It translates the Mr. Knightley uncomfortable age gap to her uncomfortable flirtation with her ex-stepbrother Josh, and the Regency class system maps beautifully onto the status quo of a Beverly Hills high school. I'm also not going to be talking about the 1970s adaptation either, although I like the persuasion and Sense and Sensibility from that era. Jane Austen actually thought that no one else would like Emma, that she was the only one who would like her own character, but I think actually the reason why Emma is very popular and probably second favourite to Lizzie Bennet is because she similarly has the self-realisation about how she fits into the world and that she needs to change and that she maybe doesn't know as much about the world as she thought she did, which is a very sort of early 20s life experience to go through. So that's why she feels threatened by the new arrivals in her small world where she's queen in Highbury, because Mrs. Elton is really horrible and wants to be Queen Bee as well, and Emma doesn't realise that actually they're very similar because Emma is trying to control Harriet's fate and Mrs. Elton is trying to control Jane Fairfax's fate. Because she doesn't have to marry, she sort of looks at other people's lives and likes playing matchmaker. I think that could make you very sort of distanced from her, but you do get to actually get quite close to her emotionally. Emma's mother died when she was very young, and it doesn't seem to have a big impression on her. I think Jane Austen portrays it as that Miss Taylor kind of takes her mother's place. So I think in Wives and Daughters it's shown much better with Molly Gibson, that even though Molly can't remember her mother, actually it does have an effect on her that her mother died and she misses her. So I think that's something you could explore more with Emma's character, to show that there are voids in her life. It's not just that she's stuck in this small world where she's at the top and therefore there aren't many people to match her, either in riches or cleverness. Emma has never really had anyone who's much higher above her who can tell her what to do, apart from Mr. Knightley, as we'll see later on. But also she has kind of not had this mother figure, because really Miss Taylor is basically her sort of sister's age, being played by Jodie May, who actually played a romantic rival to Romola Garai in Daniel Deronda, another period drama by George Eliot. So I think it's kind of not really a proper mother figure in the same way. The BBC and ITV version of Emma both have her imagining Jane Fairfax being saved by Mr. Dixon in a very romantic way. You kind of see that she's letting her imagination run away with her. And in the BBC version, she almost gets swept off a cliff and then Mr. Dixon saves her and they sort of look into each other's eyes. And then in the ITV version, she almost gets swept off a boat. And apparently that's really romantic, but actually it looks freezing cold and horrible. But basically, Emma is showing that she is fanciful, kind of like how she sarcastically says Mr. Knightley must see her at the start of the book, because she is getting a bit too into it. Because her life is so boring in Highbury, she's getting very engaged in this narrative of Mr. Dixon, even though he is engaged and then married to Miss Campbell, who Jane Fairfax was companion to. She is starting to think, oh, maybe he liked Jane Fairfax more than Miss Campbell, and that's actually a very scandalous thing to think. So Emma really shows that she hasn't got enough in her character. In the ITV version she's much more sarcastic though, whether Emma in the BBC version is quite boisterous. So here we go. Surprisingly, for someone who sometimes wonders if Britain's best era of period drama was finished by the time I was born in 2000, I actually hold the two more recent versions in high regard. I think that all the versions have wonderful music, either with the country dances to Mr. Isaac's Maggot in the ITV version and Ship's Cook in 2009, or the memorable themes done in operatic style in 2020 and gaining composer Rachel Portman an Academy Award for the Miramax version. Emma is played by Gwyneth Paltrow, and I'm afraid I don't really like the way she plays it because it feels very put on. I don't think she really knows how a posh English person from the Regency era would have spoken, and I think that it perhaps is a bit like in Nicholas Nickleby with Anne Hathaway, with an American director thinking that she can do a wonderful English accent. And it starts off quite like Google Maps, the world is sort of spinning, and then you zoom in and you get these sort of miniature paintings of the actors. And at first I was really excited because I love it when there's artistry in films, but then I sort of looked closer and I realized they weren't very good miniatures. And then I remembered that Emma isn't very good at painting. It's actually a big part of the book. So I was like, oh, it's Emma's pictures, isn't it? And it is. It's a globe that she's painted for Mrs. Weston for her wedding. But I thought it's a bit of a shame, and I wish they just had a separate person who'd done some very good paintings of the actors, and then separately they could show that Emma herself is not very good at miniatures. I get that it shows her character better because Emma doesn't really practice what she ought to. She doesn't practice painting, she doesn't read the books she says she's going to read, and she doesn't practice piano, which is why she gets very jealous of Jane Fairfax, because Mrs. Bates is always going on about how good Jane Fairfax is at everything because Jane Fairfax applies herself. And this is a very warm and cozy version of Emma. It's sort of like a firelight glow with yellow lighting, but I find the framing quite obvious, and I think even though it's perfectly enjoyable, it's not really very interesting. They could have done more of it, and that's sort of shown by the other versions. Unfortunately, Andrew Davies, fresh off Pride and Prejudice, which was really successful, was too late to get BBC to commission him for Emma. Sandy Welch was chosen by the BBC because she'd already done Mrs. Gaskell's North and South for them, and she'd also done Dickens's Our Mutual Friend, both of which are amazing adaptations. So instead he had to go to ITV, and I think even though he still has amazing writing in whatever he writes, Kate Beckinsdale playing Emma doesn't really work. I think she would have been better cast as Jane Fairfax because she's got dark hair, and also she plays it quite inhibited and cold. She's still likeable, but she's quite reserved, and Emma is supposed to be quite open. In the 2009 version, Romola Garai plays it really well, and I think she looks quite like Michael Gambon's daughter, so I really like seeing that. And you actually get to see her as a child as well, because it's a 4-hour TV series rather than a film like the others are. So you get to see her growing up and kind of understand why she's grown up into this spoilt child who's had a bit too much her own way, but because she's witty and funny, people kind of indulge her. And her governess has only been like an older sister really to her, so has never really controlled her and disciplined her in the way that would help her understand how to respect people's lives more. She's kind of used to manipulating people a little bit, especially since her father is kind of a hypochondriac who she has to pander to. She is kind of looking after him. And I think in the 2009 version, Emma is the most likeable. She's very warm and empathetic. And I think you can see that she feels deeply for people, and that's why she is trying to influence their lives. It's really difficult to know whether I prefer the 2009 TV series or the 2020 film starring Anya Taylor-Joy, because Autumn de Wilde really went almost Wes Anderson in how stylized she did the film. It's very pastel colours rather than the oil painting look that the 2009 one went for. It feels like a sort of chocolate box and is filmed very stylized because you get side profiles and then front on, and it feels very artistic. And also they've kind of stylized the characters as well. It's kind of like in the 1995 version of Pride and Prejudice, they've made them as exaggerated as possible. So Emma in this version is extremely bitchy. She's the queen bee, so she is very snobby openly. You're not trying to like her, you're trying to sort of see her as this very spoilt girl who has always had her own way and doesn't really think about how other people feel. So in her head maybe she's helping people, but it is very obvious that she is not helping people. And I think that's actually really good because it gives her a bigger redemption arc. It makes you see more how much she changes. What all of the films do is make Emma nicer than in the book, because in the book I was really shocked by the end, where even though she gets Mr. Knightley, she is still annoyed at Harriet for liking Mr. Knightley in the first place and aspiring to be Mrs. Knightley. And you sort of think, but that's exactly what you've been telling her to think, telling her to like gentlemen like Mr. Knightley rather than poor Robert Martin, the farmer. And it's so hypocritical that she is still annoyed and holds a grudge against Harriet for feeling that way, even though that's exactly what she's been teaching Harriet to feel the entire book. So I'm not really very impressed by Emma. It feels like there's been no growth there. And I think Gwyneth Paltrow's Emma shows it similarly when she prays for Mr. Knightley to stay single. I think that's really selfish. If you really loved someone, then you would allow them to be with someone else they loved, even if it's not you. You'd want them to be happy. So I think similarly there's no growth in the book, or there's not as much growth as I would like. So in the 2020 version it's really good because Harriet comes back to her and says that she's found out who her father is and that he makes galoshes and that he's in trade. But instead of sort of looking down on him like she would have previously, she says that she is very happy for them to come to Hartfield, and she shows that she has completely lost that snobbery that made her so dislikable at the start. And it's one of the worrying things in the ITV version, and something that Emma does say in the book, which is that if Harriet had married Robert Martin, she couldn't visit her anymore and be friends. So it's very obvious that she cares a lot about class, and it's not very impressive because she's only rich because she happens to be born into that family. She hasn't earned anything. In trade, at least you've actually worked to earn your living, and she's not very accomplished either, so she hasn't earned anything. So I don't get why she looks down on people. So it's really good that most of these versions get rid of that snobbery, because otherwise I think I'd still dislike her by the end. Mr. Knightley is Emma's been there all along love interest, and he is her neighbour whose brother is married to her sister, so he's a family friend. And he's known her since she was born, and in the ITV version he keeps going on about it, and it's really uncomfortable because it highlights that there's 16 years difference in their ages. But basically he's the only person who ever takes Emma up on her meddling because he's known her so long, so he feels like he can tell her what's what a bit. And I'm more convinced by their love story in some versions than in others. For instance, the Miramax version actually does convince me quite well because they do look similar ages. And Jeremy Northam plays it as kind of romantic hero. He doesn't play it grumpy, which I think is probably realistically what the book character is supposed to be like. So he plays it quite charming and good-natured, which is very different to Mark Strong's version in the ITV version, because he plays it incredibly angry. He's basically personally offended by anything, and he's very gruff. I get why Mark Strong went on to play lots of villains rather than romantic heroes, because he actually made the baby cry when him and Emma are holding their niece. It was quite difficult to film because the baby kept crying every time that Mark Strong was holding her. In the 2009 version it's different again because he's kind of boyish and almost like a school prefect. He's a bit awkward and vulnerable, and I think that suits how emotional Emma also is, other than when he kind of refers to Robert Martin marrying Harriet as an expansion on his land. He's actually very likeable. And then in the 2020 version, this is my favourite version because it's played by Johnny Flynn, and I think he absolutely made Vanity Fair because he played Dobbin, and it's a similar sort of earnest good man who speaks from the heart. He's very passionate, and I think he did the best. Badly done indeed. There's a really odd bit at the start of the 2020 version where you actually see him dressing, and instead of it trying to be sort of sexy like Mr. Darcy, I think it's meant to make him more vulnerable, because Mr. Knightley never really puts a foot wrong during the whole of Emma. He never does anything that's unkind or devious, so I think they were trying to show that he is human. And there's also in the deleted scenes one for Emma as well, of her dressing, and I think because she's emotionally vulnerable for a lot of the film, they decided to take it out because it's not really necessary in the same way. I'm quite into symbolism and metaphors, so I really like in the 1996 Miramax version when they are arguing and playing archery at the same time, and Emma keeps missing the target but Mr. Knightley is hitting the bullseye, so it represents that he is in the right and she is in the wrong. And in the 2009 version and the 2020 version, I think they make it even more exciting because they're moving through different rooms as they're arguing, and I think that really shows how heated they are and how confused and disorientated they are because they're not agreeing. It's really important for Emma to have his friendship, especially in the 2009 version. You see her asking him to pass the salt, after they've had the argument, and she's really disappointed because he doesn't look at her as he does it. He's not trying to be mean, he's just listening to something her father's saying, but she really hoped that he'd look at her and smile, so I think that's really sweet. In the ITV version, you see that she cares about him because she keeps having nightmares about him marrying different women. So at first she imagines him marrying Jane, and she says that he can't because of his nephew. When she imagines Harriet marrying him, she just says no. So she's slowly realising that she's in love with him. One of my favourite characters from Jane Austen is John Knightley, George Knightley, Mr. Knightley's brother. And he isn't really that much in the Miramax version. It's really annoying because you can hear him talking and then it doesn't even really film him. He's sort of shown more in the ITV version, kind of this magical character, so you get a sense that he's important, but then he doesn't really do what he gets to do in the 2009 version, which is warn Emma that Mr. Elton likes her and not Harriet. He's really intelligent and he can instantly see that Mr. Elton is hoping to marry the Queen of Highbury, but Emma is still saying, oh no, he's into Harriet, and trying to matchmake them. So she ignores John Knightley, and John sort of smiles wryly about this. He's a very sarcastic character and he's very family orientated. I like how much he complains as they're going to Mr. Weston's in the snow and how he'd rather be sat with his family at home just before Christmas rather than going out to socialise. He just shows a lot of emotional intelligence, which is very similar to Mr. Knightley. So Harriet Smith is the 17-year-old parlour boarder from Miss Goddard's School for Girls, who Emma takes under her wing. And I think it's a shame that she's kind of vulnerable to this sort of attention from a grand lady. Mrs. Goddard just encourages it, because Harriet is actually a very nice girl who just lives at this boarding school. She doesn't know who her parents are. Whoever's giving her the money to be a parlour boarder, so she's got a bigger room for herself rather than having to share a dorm like the other girls. She doesn't know who her parents are, so someone is paying for her to have a special room, but she can't really have a relationship with them. And also she's very socially vulnerable because she's neither upper class because she's not legitimate, but she's also not lower class because she's got more money than the others. And I think in the 1996 Miramax version she is the most forgettable Harriet. There's supposed to be a sort of comic scene where she is being encouraged by Emma to tell Mr. Elton about how great she was at helping a poor woman in their house, but actually it was Emma who was putting a blanket over her and looking after her. And I don't think that really makes sense for Harriet's character, because Harriet is much poorer than Emma. I think she'd be much more practical than her, and she'd be much better in a situation like that, whether Emma is constantly surrounded by servants. I don't get why they portrayed it that way round, except to make Harriet kind of seem like a fool and to endear you more to Emma. But I think in the 1996 version it's a bit better, because the first time you get introduced to Harriet Smith, it's at church, and Emma sort of sees a light from the window in the church can make a sort of halo around Harriet, so she sort of gets interested in her in that way. I think she seems a bit like a robot though, like Harriet seems sort of being programmed by Emma, and she's trying to mimic being sensible. And it's actually kind of weird. It's like she's not a real human being and she's just a sort of facade of a person. And it's quite funny when Harriet tells Emma that she likes Mr. Knightley, because Emma suddenly sees her as like evil. And I think it's really interesting how, even though Harriet is kind of harmless and doesn't think for herself at all, Emma somehow construes her as being this sort of mastermind who has been plotting to take Mr. Knightley off her all along. So the reason why I think Harriet would be quite practical is because we're supposed to believe that she ought to be the wife of a farmer, Robert Martin, who she likes and is friends with at the start of the book, and it's Emma who really ruins it, because Harriet is actually quite excited when Robert Martin sends a letter proposing marriage, and she probably would have just said yes if Emma hadn't sort of manipulated her into thinking that because she's not sure that means she shouldn't say yes, when actually I think Harriet just doesn't know her own feelings, and it's very obvious that she is quite into Robert Martin. It's funny that in the 2020 version, Adam from Sex Education, he plays Robert Martin, and his father, Mr. Groff in Sex Education, played Robert Martin in the ITV version, and they look very similar. You don't even have to get told that they're father and son in the TV series. So I think that's quite funny that they obviously have the look of Robert Martin, and Adam in Sex Education makes the best faces, and I think he does that similarly in the 2020 version of Emma. He doesn't really get a lot of lines, but sort of from his face, looking reproachfully at Harriet, you see how heartbroken he is. And in the 2020 version, you actually get to see Harriet and Robert kiss, so they get a bit of their own romance, as well as Emma and Mr. Knightley. And in the 2020 version, Mr. Knightley accuses Emma of having an infatuation about Harriet, and therefore sort of being blinded to that Robert Martin is actually too good for Harriet, rather than Harriet being too good for Robert Martin. And I think that's really unfair on Harriet. Although Mr. Knightley does later on admit that Harriet has great qualities and he misjudged her, but I think initially he is very much on Emma's side, thinking that Harriet's friendship with Emma is bad for Emma, whether actually I'd see it the other way around, as Harriet being very vulnerable and Emma actually coming into her life and ruining her happiness by manipulating her. And I think Mr. Knightley in the 2009 version is very good at seeing that, because he tells Emma that Robert and Harriet aren't her dolls because she used to play with dolls when she was little, which is kind of a metaphor for how she sees people, that they're her puppets who she can tell what to do and who to marry. And I think it's very obvious in the 2009 version when Emma is kind of telling Harriet that she doesn't think that Robert Martin seemed much of a gentleman, that Harriet is actually really upset, and you can see in her face that Emma's opinion of Robert Martin really hurts her, because she really likes Robert Martin. And I think the 2009 Harriet is the most likeable Harriet, because she seems like an older sister to the other boarding school girls. She seems quite sensible, even though in the silly bit where they're trying to work out Mr. Elton's riddle, which Emma says is for Harriet, but it actually is for Emma, that Harriet kind of goes, oh, ship court, because she can't get courtship. It really isn't going into her head. But I wouldn't get that riddle either, to be honest. I presume it's sort of an old-fashioned thing that they would have gotten, and that supposedly to many readers at the time it would be obvious what Mr. Elton was getting at, but honestly, I wouldn't get courtship either. So I really feel sorry for Harriet, because she is basically an orphan, and it's really nice in the 2020 version that she does eventually sort of become known to her father, or at least off screen. So I think that's quite nice, and I like the 2020 version and the 2009 version of Harriet because they feel like real human beings. But I think in the 1996 version, she's just a foolish girl who almost deserves to be played about with by Emma, which I think is really unfair on her character. So Mr. Elton is the pompous vicar who Emma plans for Harriet to marry because she sees him as suitable for Harriet as opposed to Robert Martin, the farmer. And I think he's really forgettable in the Miramax version. I can't really remember much about him except that he's helping Emma with preparing for the Harvest Festival. And again, he's quite forgettable in the ITV version. She imagines Harriet and him getting married and them showing their gratitude to her for getting them together in the first place. And Harriet says that her father's turned out to be a baronet, which is of course what Emma would want him to be. He's much funnier in the 2009 version and the 2020 version. In the 2020 version, he keeps doing these sort of pauses as if he's saying something really important or about to, and it's kind of like he's in a play. Everything is very staged in the 2020 version, so I think it really works and is very funny. And then he's sort of hilariously awkward in the 2009 version, and he's played by Blake Ritson, who a couple of years before had played Edmund in Mansfield Park. And I have the unpopular opinion that Mansfield Park was really good, because I think Fanny is played as both long-suffering, but at the same time you don't dislike her because she stands up for herself a bit. So I really like that version. I know not a lot of people do, but I think it was really good. And I think he's really good here as more of a villainous character. And of course, his proposal scene has a lot of Mr. Collins vibes going on, because he's not really taking the hint that Emma is saying no, and he keeps being smarmy and kind of thinking that she's just trying to encourage him by being maidenly and modest, but actually she just is full on saying no, and she thinks he's drunk. So it ends very badly, and I kind of don't blame him in a way, because Emma has kind of insulted him from his perspective for thinking that he would like Harriet, because Harriet is illegitimate, so not many people would want to marry her at the time in order to keep their reputation. So from his perspective, it is actually really insulting, and I get why he kind of shuns her a bit when he has married Mrs. Elton. Something that's never really made known to me, especially in the adaptations, is whether or not he and Mr. Knightley were actually friends. I think they were probably on friendly terms before, because Mr. Knightley mentions being in conversations with him where there's just men present, and knowing from those conversations that he is more interested in the future Mrs. Elton than he is in someone like Harriet. But I think later on, when Mr. Elton snubs Harriet at the ball, that's when he kind of turns against Mr. Elton, and he deliberately dances with Harriet to show that he doesn't see Harriet in the same way. So that's probably when they stop being friends. Now we come to the spoiler part of this video, so if you haven't read Emma or you haven't seen any of the adaptations, then you might not want to continue, because this is an important secret of Emma, and that is that Jane and Frank are secretly engaged. So Emma doesn't know this, Mr. Knightley guesses. In the 2009 version, you sort of get a few hints because you see a lot more of Frank and Jane because there's 4 episodes, so it has a bit of an advantage on the others. I think it's really obvious in the 1996 ITV version. Andrew Davies deliberately shows you in the background, whilst Emma is oblivious, them sort of having tiffs and that sort of thing. So it's very obvious from that, and you get hints in the book, like Frank, for instance, supposedly fixing Miss Bates's scissors for ages, like for an hour, and it's very obvious that he's actually there to see Jane. And of course the piano again, which he very much tries to throw suspicion onto Mr. Dixon about, but it was actually him. He didn't go to London just to get a haircut, he in fact went to get the piano for Jane. But in the 2020 version, it's not obvious at all. I think it's kind of impossible to tell, because other than them changing the subject abruptly when Emma is talking to them about the other, it's actually not very obvious because there's no sort of small looks or anything like that. So I think that's a bit unfair. I think it's much better when you can actually tell, and it's not actually bad in the ITV version when it's just blatantly told to the audience, because the whole point is to kind of laugh at Emma's expense, is not necessarily to have it as a big detective thing. Although I think Anthony Horowitz, the Foyle's raw screenwriter and creator, he kind of saw all great literature as detective fiction, and I think he sees Pride and Prejudice like that when you're finding out that Wickham is in fact a villain. And I think similarly he'd probably see it in Emma, because the whole point is that there are little clues that Jane and Frank are engaged. They got engaged at Weymouth, but actually Emma and probably most of the readers only find that out later in the book when it is revealed, because Frank's aunt dies, and that's the whole point why they were having it as a secret, because Frank's aunt is a big snob and would have probably disinherited him had she known, because Jane is poor. But once she's dead, which they seem quite happy about in the 2009 version, and then they remember that they ought to be sad about it. Basically, now that she's dead, they can get married. So it's really nice, and you sort of see them reunite in the 2009 version, because it's gotten so mentally draining for Jane that actually she does break off the engagement for a bit, but they do get back together and eventually get married. Mr. Knightley feels sorry for her because he sees Frank as definitely not deserving Jane, and I always kind of thought that Mr. Knightley and Jane would make a better pair, although Mr. Knightley says that he prefers someone who's open, like Emma. So I guess that's the one thing that Emma has better than Jane, is that she is very open, whether Jane is quite reserved, which Frank says that he doesn't like to Emma, but that's again throwing away the suspicion that Emma might have. And Emma really is being very self-absorbed in believing Frank Churchill when Frank keeps saying that he doesn't like Jane's haircut and stuff like that. He's trying to put her off, but really Emma should realise that Jane is very attractive and that Frank might like her at least. You do kind of wonder whether it was actually Frank Churchill who saved Jane in Weymouth rather than Mr. Dixon, because Frank definitely uses Mr. Dixon as a sort of decoy in order for no one to suspect that Jane and he are engaged, so that they expect an affair between Jane and Mr. Dixon. And he does this by horribly, in the word puzzle, spelling out Dixon. And he says blunder as well to Jane, although no one else gets it, especially Emma. But that's about him accidentally saying something that Jane told him in a letter, and he shouldn't have known that, and people sort of see it but they're a bit confused, where actually it's because he knew that from writing a lot of letters with Jane. In the ITV version, I recognised him and I was really confused for a bit, and then I realised that it is young Scrooge from Muppet Christmas Carol. And now whenever I watch it, I kind of expect Kermit the Frog to sort of appear as well, because he's wearing a very similar outfit, because Regency sort of men's clothes and Victorian men's clothes aren't dissimilar. So I sort of expect all the Muppets to appear and start singing a song. In the 2009 version, the costume designer actually based him a little bit on Keats the poet, so he's a bit foppish and romantic. And I think it's very odd in the 2009 version that he rests his head on Emma's lap. I think that would be scandalous even now to do that with someone else's boyfriend. So I was quite surprised, and I think it's part of the anachronistic body language that they do in that, because they're trying to sort of make it more human and more understandable to a modern audience how unfair it is on Jane that Frank is flirting so much with Emma, yes, as a decoy, is also just being unfair on Jane, and I think is part of the reason why she breaks up with him for a bit. Overall, even though he is sort of playing the romantic rival like Mr. Wickham, he's not half as bad as Mr. Wickham. He does marry Jane in the end because he promised he would, and he does really love her, which is why he wants to marry her even though she's poor. And I also feel sorry for him because his father did kind of abandon him to his aunt when he was young, and I know that Mr. Weston did that because he wanted the best future for him, and he knew that Frank would be really rich if he was brought up by his aunt. But it also is painful because Mr. Weston probably could have got a nanny and had Frank with him, and that's kind of why I'm not surprised that Frank doesn't really treat his father in the way you'd expect a son to treat his father, doing his duty, as Mr. Knightley says, by going to his wedding, because he's not really been like a father. He hasn't been brought up with him. Both he and Jane had kind of a tragic childhood. I definitely prefer Jane Fairfax as a character to Emma. She's definitely a foil with dark hair. Emma often has blonde hair. And Emma's kind of an anti-hero, whether Jane Fairfax is sort of the usual long-suffering protagonist that we would expect. I don't think she's very likeable in the ITV version because she's very cold and intense. She's constantly angry, and I think it's very similar to how Olivia Williams plays Jane Austen herself in Mr. Austen Regrets, because she kind of plays her as very sarky and sarcastic, and she's not a very likeable person. And I think again in the ITV version of Emma, she doesn't play Jane Fairfax as very likeable either, which I think is a shame because I think Jane is a very likeable character, and she's much more sweet in the 2009 version. You get kind of clues like John Knightley seeing her going to post a letter, and he sort of wonders about that and asks her at a social event, and then Mrs. Elton gets very intrigued and then says, oh no, you can have our letters put with ours. And Emma actually stands up for Jane, which shows more that she's got a better character because she is trying to be friendly towards Jane, and she says that Jane probably wouldn't want to do that for privacy's sake. And then of course Mrs. Elton is quite put out, but she probably would have been sneaking a peek at Jane's letters, to be honest, and then she'd know that Jane and Frank were engaged. So it's quite good that both Jane and Emma sort of stand up for her. And it's quite nice in the 2009 version as well, because they do end up sort of saying that they'll be friends, so there's sort of a conclusion to that. And there's supposed to be a kind of conclusion in the 2020 version, but that was a deleted scene where Jane and Emma get to talk, and Emma sort of says, Frank doesn't deserve you, and I don't deserve Mr. Knightley, so they sort of reconcile, which is quite nice, because before Emma was very, very jealous of Jane, and actually in the 2020 version you get a much more assertive Jane Fairfax, because Jane very obviously doesn't like Emma either, because she kind of rolls her eyes as Emma is singing The Last Rose of Summer, which is a really beautiful song, and I still like it. Emma is singing it very pompously, and it's clear that she hasn't practiced a lot, so as soon as Jane gets on the piano, she immediately stuns everyone with her amazing piece. Emma gets very jealous of her and Mr. Knightley when they're singing a duet, because obviously if people sing a duet together then they're going to get married. It's Jane Austen. But basically whenever anyone plays a duet with another person, someone gets jealous because they start to imagine them getting married. So Mr. Knightley, Johnny Flynn with his wonderful singing voice, is on the violin and singing Drink to Me Only with Thine Eyes, and it's a duet with Jane Fairfax on the piano. So you can see that from a musical point of view, they are much more matched. In the Miramax version, you get Emma being jealous of Jane Fairfax because Mr. Knightley tells her to look after herself, and Mrs. Weston actually sort of suspects that they are secretly a couple, which I think is a very anachronistic sort of term to use. I don't think that's something that they'd say back then, as far as I know. And also, it kind of seems underhand for Mr. Knightley. I don't think that's something he'd do. If he was courting a woman back then he'd do it openly, and he'd probably get engaged to Jane very quickly. So it's really odd for them to sort of think that Mr. Knightley secretly gave Jane the piano, because there's no reason why he should hide it. But overall, I really love Jane Fairfax's character, and I think she is especially good in the 2009 version. Mr. Knightley can remember that once Miss Bates paying attention to Emma would have been an honour, but now their roles are reversed. Miss Bates has gone down in the world and she is having to live as a spinster with her deaf mother. And then the 2009 version is really tragic because you see them at the start about to lose their house, and they're having to send little Jane Fairfax away because they can't support her financially anymore. They're really upset, and it's kind of a trauma that they both have to live with for the rest of the series, because the mother stops talking, and then Miss Bates, in reaction to that, never stops talking, never stops reading out Jane's letters, and you can see that she's trying to sort of fight the guilt that they had to send Jane away in the first place. So she's trying to pretend that Jane is still there with them by constantly reading her letters out to Emma. She's kind of slowly going mad from being traumatized by this sudden loss of her wealth and the sudden loss of her niece as well. And it's kind of this mix of tragedy and comedy in her character. She's really annoying in the Miramax version because you can't get a word in edgeways, and she's kind of like an annoying schoolgirl. But she's played very well by comedians. She's played by Mrs. Faulty in the ITV version, by Miranda in the 2020 version, and the mother from Friday Night Dinner in the 2009 version. And I think in the 2020 version, the way you show Emma realising as soon as she said it that it wasn't okay, when she insults Miss Bates in front of people at the Box Hill party, I think that's done so well because you zoom into Emma's face and you see her catching herself just as she said it, and then you zoom into Miss Bates's face and you see how upset she is. And even though other people are talking, you keep zoomed in onto both of them and the emotional reaction that they're having, and how upset Miss Bates is, and how Emma is feeling guilty immediately because she knows that that wasn't all right. So Miss Bates is a really important part of Emma realising about herself that she is becoming someone she doesn't like, very much influenced by Frank Churchill, because he is the one who starts the sort of silliness at the Box Hill party. In the book, you kind of get paragraphs and paragraphs of Miss Bates talking to really hit home that she is a non-stop talker, and it's actually very wearing for the people around her. And I think this is shown really well in the 2009 version, where you have Emma as a little girl and Miss Bates is over at Hartfield reading out a letter from Jane, and then you have her grown up and Miss Bates is still reading out a letter from Jane. So you see that she's kind of lived for years hearing about Jane Fairfax, which is why she can't stand the very name of Jane Fairfax, and also why she sort of lets herself slip at the Box Hill party. But you kind of get a bit of closure at the end of the 2009 version, because Miss Bates' mother does actually speak at the end, so she's sort of come to terms with it all, and now that Jane is back and engaged, they can kind of live with what happened a bit better. Thank you for watching my Emma video. I think one of the reasons why the adaptations have such different interpretations of the characters, especially Emma and Mr. Knightley, is because Jane Austen was at a time when she was pioneering free and direct speech, when you hear the character's thoughts as third person, so you're sort of indistinct about whether or not it is the narrator or it is the character thinking. But that is much more common nowadays, so you sort of don't fully get what each character is thinking because it's behind this sort of decorum and formal behaviour. The literary critic Michael Ward says that the reason why people reread Jane Austen is because of atmosphere, because they like soaking up the sort of Regency world and all her characters and the social satire. And he said that's opposed to Agatha Christie's kind of plot-based books, which I think is really unfair, because I think there's a lot of plot in Jane Austen and there's a lot of atmosphere in Agatha Christie. But I get what he means, and I think that's shown really well in the 2020 version and sort of gives me hope, because The Persuasion was so bad, the recent one, but Emma was only 4 years ago, so I think if they keep going in that direction, they can go really artsy and stylistic, but as long as they keep the key plot points and don't sort of blur over them like in the 1996 Miramax version, then they can still do really good adaptations.